There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They were the camouflage of a Tuesday night, or the quiet hum of a refrigerator, or the muted soundtrack of a film you'll forget by morning. You don't recognize them as pivotal until long after they've passed, when you're looking back and you see the fine, indelible line they drew across your timeline, separating everything that came before from everything that came after. For me, that moment smelled like worn cotton, like the faint, clean scent of Julian's shampoo, and felt like the impossible weight of his head resting on my shoulder. The movie had ended credits ago, the screen a blank, black mirror reflecting the soft glow of the lamp in the corner of my living room. The city outside was a distant, murmuring beast, but in here, the only sound was the gentle cadence of his breathing, a slow and steady rhythm that had become the metronome of my own frantic, silent heart. He'd fallen asleep about halfway through the second act. It had started with a subtle slump, a gradual surrender to the exhaustion that had been clinging to him for weeks, a ghost riding on his shoulders. Then, his head had tilted, slowly, inevitably, until it found its resting place in the curve of my neck and shoulder. Every muscle in my body had immediately frozen. I became a statue, a study in stillness, terrified that the slightest twitch might wake him, might shatter the fragile, sacred peace of the moment. I had sat there for over an hour, my own body aching with the rigid posture, my arm going numb beneath his weight, but I wouldn't have moved for anything. It was a strange kind of pleasant agony, a sacrifice I was more than willing to make. This was the closest I had been to him in the 7 years I had known him, a proximity that was both a profound gift and an exquisite form of torture. I had loved Julian for almost as long as I had known him. It was a quiet, patient love, one I had packed away and stored in a locked room deep inside myself. It was a fact of my life, like the sun rising or the seasons changing, something I had accepted and learned to live with, never expecting it to be anything more than a silent, one-sided ache. Our friendship was a carefully constructed edifice, built on a foundation of late-night conversations, shared jokes, and an easy, uncomplicated companionship. I was the quiet observer, the steady anchor, and he was the brilliant, kinetic force of nature, the one who pulled me out of my shell. I would never have risked that foundation for the selfish, impossible hope of something more. So, I kept my feelings hidden, a collection of undeveloped photographs stored in a darkroom, too precious and too dangerous to expose to the light. But now, with him asleep on my shoulder, the air thick with unspoken things, the boundaries we had so carefully maintained felt like they were dissolving. It was as if a slow, warm tide was creeping into the spaces between us, blurring the lines between friend and something else. My mind, a relentless analyst, was cataloging every sensation. The pressure of his cheek against my collarbone, the soft puff of his breath against my skin with every exhale, the way a few strands of his dark hair tickled my jaw. It was an overload of data, a deluge of sensory information that my heart was desperately trying to interpret. This was not the casual, brotherly touch we sometimes shared, a clap on the back, a brief hug. This was different. This was an act of surrender. He had sought out my space, my presence, as a place of rest, and in his sleep, his body had closed the remaining distance without pretext or apology. The logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me safe for all these years, offered up a dozen rational explanations. He was exhausted from his brutal hours at the tech firm he worked for. He was emotionally drained from the recent, messy implosion of his relationship with Sarah. He was simply seeking comfort from his closest friend, and I was reading far too much into an unconscious act. It meant nothing. It was just sleep. But the other part of me, the hopeful, foolish, yearning part, saw it as a sign. It was a confession his sleeping body was making that his waking mind could not. It was a testament to a deeper connection, a trust that went beyond the easy camaraderie of our friendship. It was a question, asked without words. Are you a safe harbor for me? My arm, the one pinned between his body and the back of the couch, was screaming with pins and needles. It was a dull, insistent ache that was beginning to border on genuine pain. I knew I had to move, just slightly, to get the circulation back. I held my breath, and with the slow, deliberate care of a bomb disposal expert, I tried to shift my weight, to ease my shoulder out from under him just a fraction of an inch. I moved a millimeter, then another. I was almost successful, a sliver of air opening up between us. And then he stirred. A low, soft sound rumbled in his chest, a murmur of protest. His arm, which had been resting limply at his side, moved with a sudden, surprising strength. It snaked around my waist, his hand gripping the fabric of my t-shirt at my side. He didn't wake up. Instead, he pulled me closer, tucking his head more firmly into the space he'd already claimed, and settled back into a deep, even breathing. My own breath caught in my throat. The pins and needles in my arm were instantly forgotten, replaced by a roaring in my ears. He had pulled me closer. It wasn't a reflexive twitch. It was an action, an instinct. His sleeping self had felt me pulling away and had reached out to stop me, to keep me there. The careful logic I had been constructing crumbled into dust. This was no longer ambiguous. This was not just him seeking comfort. This was him refusing to let that comfort go. The locked door inside me, the one behind which I kept all my feelings for him, creaked open. Hope, terrifying and brilliant, spilled out like a flood of light into the dark, quiet corners of my heart. The line had been drawn. This was the moment. This was the before, and whatever happened when he woke up, whenever that might be, would be the after. And as I sat there, trapped in the most wonderful prison I could imagine, I realized I was completely, irrevocably lost. I didn't want him to ever let go. It hadn't always been like this fragile, terrifying dance on the edge of something new. For most of our friendship, the lines had been clear, the boundaries respected. Our bond was a piece of architecture we had built together, sturdy and reliable, with designated rooms for every aspect of our lives. There was the room for easy laughter, the one for serious debate, the one for quiet, mutual support. But there were no doors between my secret, hidden affection and the main structure of our friendship. I had made sure of that. The risk of a collapse was too great. We met in college, a classic study in contrasts. Julian was the sun, and I was a creature of the shade. He was the star swimmer, a campus celebrity whose charisma was as palpable as the chlorine that seemed to perpetually cling to his skin. He moved through the world with an effortless confidence, a whirlwind of bright energy, easy smiles, and a laugh that could fill any room. He was popular, not because he tried to be, but because people were simply drawn to his orbit, like planets to a star. I, on the other hand, was a quiet photography major, more comfortable behind a lens than in front of one. I navigated the crowded university landscape by finding the quietest paths, the emptiest library carols, the corners of rooms where I could observe without being observed. My world was one of light and shadow, of capturing fleeting moments, of seeing the beauty in stillness. Our worlds should never have collided, but they did, thanks to a mutual friend and a disastrous group project in a mandatory literature class. Our friend, Mark, had roped us both into his group, thinking, I suppose, that Julian's charm and my diligence would balance each other out. For the first week, it was exactly as I'd expected. Julian would show up late, flash a dazzling apology, and contribute a few brilliant but half-formed ideas before rushing off to swim practice. I would stay behind, methodically organizing his chaotic genius into coherent paragraphs, quietly resentful but also secretly fascinated. I watched him the way I watched a storm gathering on the horizon, with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He was beautiful, in the way a wild, untamable thing is beautiful. The turning point came one night when we were the last two left in the study lounge, staring at a mountain of research for our paper on Moby Dick. It was past midnight, and my patience was worn thin. Julian, for once, wasn't rushing. He was just staring at the book, a strange, contemplative look on his face. He finally broke the silence. You know, he'd said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Everyone thinks Ahab is the main character. But he's not. He's just the noise. The real story is Ishmael. It's about the guy who watches it all happen, who tries to make sense of the madness, and who survives to tell the tale. He had looked at me then, a direct, searching gaze. You get that, don't you? You're an Ishmael. It was the first time anyone had ever really seen me. Not just looked at me, but understood the quiet, observational nature that defined me. In that moment, he wasn't the campus celebrity. He was just a guy who understood stories. And I wasn't just the quiet, studious kid. I was someone who had been recognized. We talked for hours after that, not about the project, but about everything else. We talked about the suffocating pressure of his athletic scholarship and the lonely freedom of my artistic pursuits. We talked about our families, our fears, our ridiculous, secret dreams. It was the night the foundation of our friendship was laid, a deep and solid base of mutual understanding that transcended our surface-level differences. From that night on, we were inseparable. It was an unlikely pairing that baffled most of our friends, but to us, it made perfect sense. He provided the energy, I provided the calm. He would drag me to parties, and I would be the one to make sure he drank a glass of water and got home safely. I would be holed up in the darkroom for days, and he would appear at the door with pizza and a demand that I see the sun. He respected my need for solitude, and I understood his need for an audience. He was the only person who could coax me into a crowd, and I was the only person he seemed to be able to be truly quiet with. We were two halves of a strange, complementary whole. The love, for my part, grew so gradually I barely noticed it happening. It wasn't a sudden lightning strike. It was more like the slow, patient process of a photograph developing in a chemical bath. The image had always been there, latent, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. I think the moment of true realization came during our junior year. I was at the aquatic center, tasked with taking photos for the university newspaper. I was there to capture the swim meet, the spectacle, the splashing, and the cheering. But my lens, of its own accord, kept finding Julian. I watched him on the starting block, his body a perfect sculpture of coiled potential. I watched him cut through the water, a seamless, powerful union of grace and strength. But the shot that broke me was after his race. He'd won, of course, but instead of celebrating, he'd hung on the lane line, head down, breathing hard, the water streaming from his hair. The roar of the crowd faded away. All I could see was him, in that solitary moment of exhaustion and relief. He was vulnerable, stripped of the charismatic armor he usually wore. And in that moment, I saw not just my friend, but the man I was hopelessly, irrevocably in love with. The shutter clicked. I had captured it. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and absolute, that I could never show that picture to anyone. I took that feeling, that photograph, and locked it away. Julian had started dating Sarah, a bright, kind political science major, a few months later. They were a perfect couple, everyone said so. They looked good together, laughed at the same jokes, and seemed to share a common trajectory for their lives. I became their third wheel, the loyal friend who was always there, a permanent fixture in their shared life. I liked Sarah truly. She was good to him. And so, I learned to perform my role flawlessly. I was the supportive friend. I was the confidant. I was the steadfast, platonic presence. I built the walls around that hidden room inside me higher and thicker. It was an act of self-preservation, a necessary measure to protect the most important friendship I had ever had. The years passed. We graduated. We moved to the same city. Julian's relationship with Sarah deepened. My love for him remained, a quiet, constant hum beneath the surface of my life, a secret I intended to take to my grave. The shift began on a rainy Tuesday in October. It was the kind of relentless, soul-dampening rain that makes the whole world feel gray and weary. My doorbell rang late, close to 11. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened it to find Julian standing on my doorstep, soaked to the bone, without a coat or an umbrella. His usually bright eyes were hollow, his face pale. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, as if the rain had washed away not just the color from the world, but the very substance of him. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me, a desperate, shipwrecked look in his eyes. "It's over," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "Sarah and I. It's over." I didn't ask questions. I didn't offer platitudes. I just stepped aside and opened the door wider, a silent invitation into the warmth and dry of my apartment. He stumbled in, leaving a trail of water on my hardwood floors. I didn't care. I grabbed a towel and started drying his hair, the way you would with a child. He just stood there, passive, letting me take care of him. That was the beginning. He had been in a storm, and my quiet apartment, my quiet presence, had become his port. In the weeks that followed, my home became his sanctuary. The breakup had been brutal, a 5-year relationship disintegrating into accusations and bitter regrets. Compounding that was the immense pressure of his job. He was a lead consultant at a software firm, a job that demanded 70-hour weeks and constant travel. The combination of professional stress and personal heartbreak was eroding him, grinding him down day by day. He started showing up at my place more and more often, sometimes with a text, sometimes without. He wasn't looking for advice. He was looking for silence. He would sit on my couch, staring into space, while I worked on editing photos. Sometimes he would talk, disjointed fragments about his day, about a memory of Sarah, about a bug in a line of code. Other times, he would say nothing at all for hours, simply existing in the quiet space I provided. I would make him tea. I would make sure he ate something. I became his caretaker, his anchor in the turbulent sea of his own life. I was careful, so careful, to keep my own feelings out of it. I was performing the role of good friend, and I was determined to do it perfectly. My own heart was a minefield of conflicting emotions. It ached to see him in so much pain, yet a selfish, shameful part of me was thrilled to have him so close, to be the one he turned to. I was the Ishmael to his Ahab again, but this time, the whale was his own grief, and it was threatening to pull him under. The first time he fell asleep on my couch, it felt significant, but still within the realm of platonic friendship. He had been talking, his voice growing slower, his sentences trailing off, until he had just stopped. I had looked over from my laptop to see his head slumped against the armrest, his face peaceful for the first time in weeks. A profound tenderness had washed over me. I had gently lifted his legs onto the cushions, taken off his shoes, and covered him with the thick wool blanket I kept on the back of the chair. I watched him sleep for a long time, the shadows under his eyes looking stark in the dim light. It was an act of pure care, nothing more. Or so I told myself. But as I watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, I felt the old, familiar ache in my own. The photograph in the darkroom was beginning to develop. The ritual began a few weeks after that. It started with movie nights. It was his idea. I can't stand the silence in my own apartment, he'd confessed. It's too loud, so he started coming over in the evenings. We'd order takeout and put on a movie, a mindless distraction for both of us. At first, we sat on opposite ends of my admittedly small couch, a safe, respectable distance. Then, one night, he'd shifted, stretching his long legs out, and his foot had brushed against my calf. A jolt, electric and sharp, had shot through me. Neither of us had moved. The contact was maintained, a single, small point of connection in the wide expanse of the couch. My entire consciousness had narrowed to that single point. I was hyper-aware of the texture of his sock against my jeans, the slight warmth radiating from him. The next time, it was more. He'd seemed more exhausted than usual, his shoulders slumped in a permanent state of defeat. "Mind if I just?" he'd mumbled, gesturing vaguely at my side. Before I could answer, he had leaned his head against my shoulder. It was a tentative, questioning gesture. I had frozen, my heart starting a frantic, staccato rhythm against my ribs. I had given a small, jerky nod, unable to form words. And so he had stayed there. That was the first time. It became a regular occurrence. Movie night meant Julian, inevitably, would end up using my shoulder as a pillow. It became our unspoken routine, our ritual. He would arrive. We would eat. We would start the movie. And at some point, he would gravitate towards me, seeking a physical anchor in the quiet darkness of my living room. Each time, my mind would go into overdrive. I would analyze the angle of his head, the pressure of his weight, the sound of his breathing. I was a seismologist monitoring a dormant volcano, terrified of the eruption but also mesmerized by the subtle tremors that hinted at the immense power beneath the surface. Was this just a desperate need for human contact? Was I just a convenient, warm body? Or was it more? Was it me, specifically, that he needed? The plausible deniability was a torture chamber. He was always tired. He was always stressed. It was always justifiable as a simple, platonic act of comfort. He never acknowledged it the morning after. We would just drink coffee and talk about the weather, the awkward intimacy of the previous night hanging in the air between us, unspoken and unexamined. I was living in a state of suspended animation, caught between the sheer bliss of his closeness and the terror of what it might, or might not, mean. The ritual escalated. One night, a thunderstorm had knocked out the power in his part of the city. He'd called me, his voice small. Can I stay over? Of course I'd said yes. I'd set him up on the couch, the place he was already so accustomed to. But as I was heading to my own room, he'd called out my name. Leo. I turned. He was standing in the hallway, silhouetted by the moonlight from the window, looking lost. It's stupid, but I don't want to be alone. I had understood immediately. I'd offered him the guest room, but he'd shaken his head. Can I just your room? The question hung in the air, heavy and fragile. He'd quickly added, the couch is fine. It's just, whatever, forget it, but the request had been made. It's fine. I'd heard myself say, my voice sounding distant. The bed's big enough. That first night, we had slept like two strangers forced to share a raft in a vast ocean, clinging to the far edges, a continent of duvet and sheet between us. I had lain awake for hours, acutely aware of every breath he took, every time he shifted in his sleep. It was an agony of proximity. But it happened again. The pretexts became flimsier. It's too late to drive home. I have an early meeting near your place. Your mattress is just more comfortable soon. He was spending more nights in my bed than his own. The space between us began to shrink. It happened incrementally. A hand brushing mine as we both reached for the blanket. A foot touching mine in the cold of the night. Then, one night, I had woken up to find his arm draped over my waist, his face buried in my back. He was fast asleep, but his body had sought mine out in the darkness. I had lain there, not daring to breathe, my heart a trapped bird beating against my ribs. This was no longer a ritual confined to the couch. This was a new territory, a more intimate and dangerous landscape. We were sharing a bed, a space of profound vulnerability, and yet we never spoke of it. We were building a new, secret world in the dark, and I had no idea what the rules were, or if I was the only one who knew we were living in it. This was the state of things, this beautiful, terrifying ambiguity. On the night, he fell asleep on my shoulder during the movie and pulled me closer when I tried to move. It was the culmination of months of unspoken invitations and hesitant advances, the quiet climax of a story that had been writing itself in the dark. The night of the crossing, as I would later come to call it, didn't begin any differently from the dozens of nights that had preceded it. It was a Thursday, and Julian had arrived at my door looking like a man who had been physically wrestled by his own anxieties and had lost. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the usual light in them dimmed to a low flicker. He'd barely spoken as we ate, just pushing food around his plate. We retreated to the couch, our familiar sanctuary, and I put on some ambient nature documentary, something with sweeping landscapes and no dialogue, knowing he didn't have the capacity for a plot. For a while, we sat in our usual starting positions, a cushion's width apart, watching glaciers calve into the sea. The silence in the room was different tonight, though. It wasn't the comfortable, companionable silence we often shared. It was heavy, taut, like a string pulled almost to its breaking point. It was filled with the things he wasn't saying, with the exhaustion that was so profound it seemed to have its own physical presence in the room. Eventually, as I knew he would, he surrendered. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire week, he shifted and leaned against me, his head finding its customary place on my shoulder. I instinctively adjusted, making a more comfortable space for him, my body now conditioned to this ritual. But tonight, he didn't immediately drift off. He remained awake, his breathing a little too conscious, a little too unsteady. His hand, which usually lay inert in his lap, found its way to my thigh, his fingers resting there lightly. It wasn't a possessive or a suggestive touch, but it was deliberate. It was an anchor. My own hand wanted, desperately, to cover his, to intertwine our fingers, to offer the reassurance he seemed to be silently begging for. But I didn't. I remained perfectly still, my role as the passive, solid object of comfort so ingrained in me that I was afraid to break character. We sat like that for a long time, watching icebergs drift across the screen. The narrator's calm voice was a distant drone, the real narrative unfolding in the tense space between us. I could feel the heat of his hand through the denim of my jeans, a small, localized star in the vast, cold universe of my anxiety. He shifted his weight slightly, and his fingers tightened their grip for a fraction of a second. It was a fleeting, almost imperceptible gesture, but to me, it was a scream in a silent room. He was holding on. He was holding on to me. The weight of his unspoken need was immense, and I was struggling under it, wanting to give him what he was asking for, but terrified of misinterpreting the request. What if I moved my hand to his, and he pulled away, the spell broken, our fragile ecosystem ruined? The fear of that rejection was a physical thing, a cold knot in my stomach. Eventually, the documentary ended. I didn't move to turn it off. The silence that descended was absolute. It was no longer taut. It had gone slack, heavy with a kind of resigned intimacy. In this new, profound quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic, unsteady drum. I could feel his. Or maybe I was just imagining it, feeling the pulse of his body against mine, a slow, deep thrum that seemed to be trying to sync up with my own chaotic rhythm. He took a deep breath, and I felt the expansion of his chest against my side. He was going to say something. I knew it. The air crackled with the impending words. Leo? His voice was a ghost in the room, a rough, quiet whisper that was barely audible. It was the first word either of us had spoken in over an hour. Yeah, I managed to reply, my own voice sounding strained and foreign to my ears. He didn't move his head from my shoulder. He just stayed there, as if gathering the courage for his next words. The seconds stretched into an eternity. I was suspended in that moment, in that single word of my name, hanging in the space between 1,000 possibilities. Can I ask you something stupid? He whispered. My heart clenched. There are no stupid questions, Julian, I said, the words a well-worn platitude that sounded hollow and inadequate in the face of the monumental tension in the room. He was silent again for another long moment. I could feel the tremor in his hand that was still resting on my leg. He was nervous. Julian, who faced down corporate boards and swam in front of thousands, was nervous. With me, in my quiet living room, he finally lifted his head from my shoulder. The loss of his weight was immediate and jarring, a sudden coldness spreading where he had been. He turned to face me, his body angled towards mine on the couch. In the dim light from the lamp, I could see his eyes, wide and dark and filled with a terrifying vulnerability. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump. Would it be okay? He began, his voice cracking on the last word. He swallowed hard and tried again. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The world stopped. The humming of the refrigerator, the distant wail of a siren, my own frantic thoughts, it all went silent. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was not a proposition. It was not a line. It was a plea. It was a confession. It was the most honest and terrifying thing anyone had ever said to me. All the months of analysis, of second-guessing, of hoping and fearing, it all coalesced into this one, simple, devastating question. He was giving me the power. He was handing me the key to that locked room inside myself and asking if it was safe to open the door. I couldn't speak. The words were trapped in my throat, a logjam of emotion. So I just looked at him, into those wide, fearful, hopeful eyes, and I nodded. It was a small movement, a barely perceptible dip of my chin, but in the charged silence of the room, it felt like a seismic event. A wave of relief washed over his face, so profound it was almost painful to watch. He leaned in slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to change my mind. I didn't. I met him halfway, closing the final few inches between us. His lips were soft, hesitant. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question, being asked again, but this time without words. It was a kiss of discovery, of disbelief. It tasted of salt and fear and a desperate, fragile hope. My hand, which had been frozen at my side, finally moved. I brought it up to his cheek, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his jaw. He shuddered at the contact, a full-body tremor, and deepened the kiss just slightly, a silent answer to his own question. In that moment, everything fell away. There was no past, no future, no friendship to risk, no heartbreak to fear. There was only the solid, undeniable reality of his lips on mine, his hand on my leg, my hand on his face. It was a landing. It was an arrival. After years of orbiting each other, of navigating the complex gravitational pulls of friendship and unspoken desire, we had finally, gently, collided. The kiss ended as softly as it had begun. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against mine. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shaky. Okay, he whispered, more to himself than to me. Okay. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know if it was the beginning of everything or the beautiful, tragic end of the one thing I couldn't bear to lose. But as he settled back against my shoulder, and this time, my arm went around him, holding him there, I knew that the world had been irrevocably altered. The crossing had been made. We were in a new country now, and we had no map. The immediate aftermath of the kiss was a quiet, breathless peace. We didn't talk. Words felt clumsy and inadequate, like trying to describe a sunset with a child's crayons. Instead, we just stayed on the couch, tangled together in a way that was new and deliberate. His head was on my shoulder again, but now my arm was wrapped securely around him, my hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady, calming beat of his heart under my palm. His own hand had moved from my thigh to my waist, his fingers laced loosely in the fabric of my shirt. It was no longer an ambiguous ritual of comfort. It was a clear, intentional act of holding and being held. Eventually, I felt his breathing deepen, the tension finally leaving his body as he drifted into an exhausted sleep. I followed him into sleep not long after, my own mind finally quiet, the relentless churn of analysis replaced by a profound, if precarious, sense of peace. For the first time in years, I fell asleep next to him without a single question in my mind. I woke to the pale, gray light of dawn filtering through my blinds. The space next to me on the couch was empty. For a moment, a hazy, sleep-addled confusion clouded my mind. Then, the memory of the night before rushed back in, sharp and vivid. The question, the kiss, the feeling of his heart beating against my hand. A slow, warm smile spread across my face. I sat up, expecting to hear him moving around in the kitchen, the familiar sounds of him making coffee. But the apartment was silent. A deep, unnerving silence. A cold knot of dread began to form in my stomach. I got up and walked into the kitchen. It was empty. The coffee maker was cold. But on the counter, propped against the sugar bowl, was a folded piece of paper. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached for it. It was a page torn from my own legal pad, the one I kept for grocery lists. The handwriting was Julian's, a familiar, hurried scrawl. Leo, had to run. Early meeting I forgot about. Coffee's on you today. Jay. That was it. No mention of the night before. No, we need to talk. No, that was amazing. Just a hurried, impersonal note that could have been left after any of the dozens of nights he had crashed on my couch. The brevity of it was a physical blow. Coffee's on you today. It was a joke, a deflection, a sentence designed to create distance. The warmth that had filled me only moments before evaporated, replaced by an icy chill. I read the note again, and then a third time, searching for a hidden meaning, a secret message between the lines. There was none. It was a wall. It was a door slammed shut. The days that followed were a special kind of hell. The silence from Julian was no longer the companionable quiet of my apartment. It was a vast, echoing void. My texts to him, usually answered within minutes, now went unanswered for hours, sometimes a full day. When he did reply, his messages were short, clipped, and devoid of their usual warmth. Me. Hey, want to grab dinner tonight? Him. 8 hours later, swamped with work. Rain check. Me. Movie marathon this weekend? Found that old sci-fi trilogy you love. Him. The next day, traveling for work. Sorry. He was busy. He was swamped. He was sorry. He was a ghost. The ritual was broken. The sanctuary had been abandoned. The man who couldn't bear the silence of his own apartment was now willingly cocooning himself in it, as long as it meant avoiding me. Each unanswered text, each lame excuse, was a small, sharp cut. The hope that had bloomed so brilliantly in my chest after the kiss began to wither, its petals turning brown and curling in on themselves. The old, familiar analyst in my brain, the one who had been so blissfully silent, woke up with a vengeance. I replayed the kiss over and over in my mind, dissecting it from every angle. Had I misread everything? Was his question not a plea for intimacy, but a moment of desperate, drunken confusion? Had he woken up the next morning filled with regret, disgusted with himself, or worse, with me? The thought was a shard of glass in my gut. Maybe I had just been a port in a storm, a temporary safe harbor, and now that the worst of his grief over Sarah had passed, he was ready to set sail again, leaving me behind on the shore. The idea that I had been used, that my deepest, most secret feelings had been unknowingly preyed upon to soothe his own temporary pain, was humiliating. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of weakness for a declaration of love. The pain of it was sharp and constant, a low-grade fever that I couldn't shake. The quiet peace of my apartment, once a source of comfort, now felt like a prison. Every corner of it held a memory of him. The couch, the kitchen, my own bed. His ghost was everywhere, a constant, silent reminder of what I had briefly thought I had, and what I had so spectacularly lost. A week of this torturous silence passed. Then another. I was a wreck. I couldn't eat. I couldn't work. My camera sat gathering dust. The world outside my lens seemed gray and uninteresting. The vibrant colors I usually saw everywhere had been leached away, leaving behind a dull, monochromatic landscape of my own misery. I knew I couldn't go on like this. The ambiguity, which had once been a source of thrilling tension, was now an unbearable weight. The silence was no longer a space for possibility. It was a breeding ground for my worst fears. I had to know. Even if the truth was the worst thing I could imagine, it would be better than this suffocating uncertainty. I had to confront him. It was a reversal of our established dynamic. For months, he had been the one to show up at my door, seeking refuge. Now it was my turn. On a cold, clear Saturday afternoon, I drove to his apartment. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I had no idea what I was going to say. I just knew that I couldn't bear another day of his silence. His apartment was in a sleek, modern building, all glass and steel. A place that had always felt as impersonal and cold as my own was warm and lived in. I stood outside his door for a full minute, my hand hovering over the buzzer, my courage failing me. I thought about turning around, about retreating back to the safety of my own misery. But then, I thought about his question. Would it be okay if I kissed you? The vulnerability in his voice, the fear in his eyes, that had been real. I was sure of it. Something had happened after that moment of realness, and I deserved to know what it was. I pressed the buzzer. The seconds ticked by. I was about to press it again when the speaker crackled to life. Yeah. His voice was flat, tired. It's me, I said, my own voice barely a whisper. There was a long pause. I could picture him on the other end, his mind racing, trying to come up with an excuse. I'm busy. I'm not feeling well. I'm not home. But he didn't. After what felt like an eternity, the buzzer sounded, a harsh, electric noise that unlocked the main door. I pushed it open and walked into the sterile lobby, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floor. His apartment was on the 4th floor. I took the elevator, my reflection in the mirrored walls showing a pale, grim-faced stranger. When the doors opened, he was there, standing in the doorway of his apartment. He looked terrible, worse than he had in the depths of his breakup. He was wearing sweatpants and a wrinkled t-shirt, and his hair was a mess. He hadn't shaved in days. But it was his eyes that struck me. They were haunted, filled with a mixture of guilt and exhaustion. He didn't meet my gaze. He just stared at a point somewhere over my shoulder. Hey, he said, his voice low. Can I come in? I asked. He hesitated for a second, then stepped back, holding the door open. His apartment was a disaster. Takeout containers were piled on the coffee table, clothes were strewn over the chairs. It smelled stale, like sleepless nights and anxiety. It was the physical manifestation of the chaos he was trying to hide. What happened, Julian? I asked, foregoing any pretense of small talk. The question hung in the messy, stagnant air between us. What do you mean? He deflected, busying himself with moving a stack of mail from one surface to another. I told you, I've just been swamped. No, I said, my voice quiet but firm. Don't do that. Don't lie to me. Not after that night. He flinched at the mention of that night, as if I had struck him. He stopped shuffling the mail and stood with his back to me, his shoulders tensed. I don't know what you're talking about. A surge of anger, hot and sharp, cut through my hurt. You don't know? I took a step closer. You come to my apartment for weeks. You sleep in my bed. You hold on to me like I'm a goddamn life raft. You ask me if you can kiss me, and then you do. And then you disappear. You leave a stupid, cowardly note about coffee, and you treat me like a stranger. And you have the audacity to stand there and tell me you don't know what I'm talking about. My voice was rising, shaking with a fury I didn't know I possessed. He finally turned to face me. The defensive mask had crumbled, replaced by a raw, painful anguish. His eyes were shining with unshed tears. I panicked, okay? He burst out, his voice cracking. I panicked. Panicked about what? I demanded, my own anger softening slightly at the sight of his raw distress. About everything, he exclaimed, running a hand frantically through his hair. About you. About me. About what that? What that kiss meant. He started pacing the small space, a caged animal. Leo, I've never felt that way before. For a guy? Ever. I was with Sarah for 5 years. Before her, it was other girls. That's who I am. Or, that's who I thought I was. He stopped and looked at me, his expression a mixture of confusion and terror. And then you. It started as just needing a friend, needing a quiet place. But then it became more. I wanted to be near you. I needed it. And that night on the couch, I could not kiss you. It was like I would have shattered if I didn't. It was the only thing that made sense in that moment. He sank onto his couch, burying his face in his hands. His voice was muffled, thick with emotion. And then I woke up the next morning, and it was daylight, and everything was real. And I was terrified. I looked at you, sleeping there, and I was so fucking terrified. What did this mean? Who am I? Did I just ruin the best friendship I've ever had because I was lonely and confused? I didn't know. I still don't know. So I ran. I ran because I'm a coward. I ran because looking at you, talking to you, it makes it all real, and I don't know how to handle it. He looked up at me, his face a mess of tear tracks and misery. I'm sorry, Leo. I'm so sorry. I hurt you. That's the last thing I ever wanted to do. All the anger, all the hurt, all the weeks of torturous analysis, it all dissolved in the face of his devastating, honest confession. He wasn't a user. He wasn't cruel. He was just a man who had stumbled into a new and terrifying country, the same one I had been living in for years, and he had no map. He was just as lost as I was. I looked at Julian, truly looked at him, and for the first time, I saw past my own long-held feelings and the narrative I had constructed around them. I saw him not as the object of my affection or the unknowing initiator of our crisis, but as a person navigating his own bewildering emotional landscape. My journey had been a long, slow acceptance of a love I had identified years ago. His was a sudden, disorienting earthquake that had shattered the foundations of his own identity. He hadn't been running from me, not really. He had been running from himself, from the terrifying implications of a feeling he had never expected to have. The anger that had propelled me to his doorstep evaporated, replaced by a wave of profound, aching empathy. He wasn't a coward. He was just scared. And I, who had lived with the fear of my own feelings for so long, understood that better than anyone. I crossed the room and sat down on the couch next to him, leaving a small, respectful space between us. The air was thick with his confession, with the wreckage of the last 2 weeks. He wouldn't look at me, just stared at his hands, which were clenched into tight fists in his lap. I thought about all the nights he had sought my touch for comfort, how his body had gravitated towards mine in sleep. Now, in the stark light of day, with everything out in the open, we were separate islands again. I had to be the one to build the bridge. You didn't ruin it, I said softly. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Our friendship, I clarified. You didn't ruin it, Julian. You just made it more complicated. A small, sad smile touched my lips. And to be fair, it was already complicated on my end. You just didn't know it. His brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? This was it. My own cliff edge. He had shown me his vulnerability, his fear. The only way forward was to match it with my own. The secret I had guarded for 7 years, the photograph locked in the darkroom. It was time to bring it into the light. I've been in love with you for years, I said. The words came out quietly, simply, without any of the drama I had always imagined would accompany them. They were just a fact, stated plainly in the messy chaos of his living room. Probably since that day, I took your picture at the swim meet in junior year. I just never said anything. I valued our friendship too much to risk it. I packed it away. I learned to live with it. I finally met his gaze, my own eyes burning with the intensity of the confession. So when you started coming over, when you started leaning on me, it wasn't just you who was confused. I was living in a state of constant hope and constant terror. Every time you touched me, I was terrified I was imagining what it meant. And every time you pulled away, I was terrified I was right. He just stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He looked utterly stunned, as if I had just told him the sky was green. He was processing years of our shared history through this new lens, recontextualizing every late-night talk, every shared meal, every moment of easy camaraderie. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the connections being made. All this time, he whispered, his voice filled with a disbelieving awe. "You never said anything. You were with Sarah," I said with a shrug. "You were happy, and you were my best friend. That was enough. It had to be." A new emotion crossed his face then, something deeper than confusion. It was a dawning understanding, a profound regret. "God, Leo," he said, his voice thick. "I'm such an idiot. All those nights. I was just taking. I was taking your warmth, your quiet, your strength. I was so wrapped up in my own misery, I never once stopped to think about what it was costing you." "It wasn't a cost," I corrected him gently. "I gave it to you freely. I hoped it meant the same thing to you that it did to me. And when you kissed me, I thought it finally did." The silence afterward, that was the part that hurt. The not knowing if I had been a fool all along. He finally closed the space between us. He shifted on the couch, and, with a hesitation that was heartbreakingly tender, he reached out and took my hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm. "You're not a fool," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I am. I was so scared of what I was feeling that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. I couldn't see you. I'm sorry," he squeezed my hand. "I don't know what this is, Leo. I don't know what to call it, or what it makes me. All I know is that the last 2 weeks, without you, have been the most miserable of my entire life. The silence in this apartment, it's not loud anymore. It's just empty, because you're not in it." And there it was. Not a grand declaration of love, but something far more valuable. An admission of need. A confession of his own. He needed me, not just as a source of comfort, but as a presence in his life. The knot of anxiety I had been carrying for 2 weeks finally, blessedly, dissolved. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. A small, tentative smile, the first real one I had seen in weeks, touched his lips. "I don't know," he admitted. "But maybe we could start by figuring it out. Together." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. "And maybe you could stay for a while? I could order a pizza. We could clean this place up. We could just be." It was a simple request, but it was everything. It was an invitation back into his life, but this time, without pretext or ambiguity. It was a beginning. "I'd like that," I said, and my own smile, genuine and relieved, finally returned. We started there, in the wreckage of his apartment and the beautiful, honest rubble of our old friendship. We didn't solve everything that day. We didn't define our relationship or map out our future. We just existed in the same space, honestly and openly for the first time. We cleaned his apartment, a quiet, domestic ballet of sorting laundry and throwing away old takeout containers. It felt symbolic, like we were clearing away the old mess to make room for something new. We ordered a pizza and ate it sitting on the floor, talking. We talked for hours, filling in the silent spaces, sharing the fears and hopes we had both kept hidden for so long. That night, I stayed. When it grew late, he looked at me, a familiar nervousness in his eyes. "Will you stay?" It was the same question he had asked before, but this time, the meaning was entirely different. It wasn't a plea to not be alone. It was a request for me to be with him. I nodded, and we went to his bedroom. This time, when we lay down, there was no continent of sheets between us. He turned towards me immediately, and I turned towards him. He wrapped his arms around me, pulling me close, and buried his face in my chest. I held him, my hand stroking his hair, my chin resting on the top of his head. There were no more questions. There was no more analysis. There was just the solid, warm weight of him in my arms, the steady beat of his heart against mine. It was a quiet, profound homecoming. The weeks that followed were a gentle unfolding. We moved slowly, cautiously, learning the rhythms of this new relationship. The grand, sweeping passion I might have once dreamed of was replaced by something quieter, deeper, and far more meaningful. Our love story was written in small, domestic moments. It was in the way he started leaving a toothbrush at my apartment, a silent declaration of permanence. It was in the way I learned to make his coffee exactly how he liked it, strong and black. It was in the nights we spent on my couch, watching movies, his head on my shoulder, but now my hand was always linked with his, a simple, constant connection. The couch, once a space of agonizing ambiguity, became our place of quiet certainty. My apartment, once his temporary sanctuary from a storm, became our shared home, a place we were building a life together. The bedroom door, which I had always left open out of a subconscious respect for our platonic boundaries, was now closed at night. It was a small, symbolic act, a drawing of a new, private boundary around the two of us, enclosing our shared world. We were learning to heal, not just from the recent rupture, but from the years of unspoken feelings and lonely self-protection. We were learning to speak a new language, one made up of quiet touches, shared glances, and the profound comfort of simply being in the same room. We were two Ishmaels who had survived our own separate storms and had finally, miraculously, found the same shore. And in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together, we began to build our home.